In the beginning, we talked about observational studies and experimental studies. These are both cases of what are called case-controlled studies, right? And we're going to go into the difference about them in more detail now. In observational studies, the researcher, again, merely observes what is happening and tries to draw conclusions just based upon these observations. So the researcher is going to observe the participants in the sample, and the sample will naturally divide into two different groups. There will be the participants who engage in the behavior that is being studied, and they will form what's called the case group. And then there's the participants who just naturally do not engage in the behavior under study, and these will be called the control group. Then, after that happens, the researcher will make comparisons between the case and control group and try and draw some conclusions. And of course, there's some problems with this. The problem is called a lurking variable. Variables for which the data is not being collected, right? It's not the variable that's understudied, but there is some variable there that is influencing it. And if it influences the outcome of the study, but it's not directly being studied itself, that is called a lurking variable. Another word that we use is confounded, and two variables are confounded if the effects of one cannot be distinguished from the effects of the other. So we want to avoid lurking or confounded variables. Okay, so that's the observational study. Now, in the experimental study, the researcher is going to actively engage, and they will try and manipulate one of the variables being studied and then try and determine how that manipulation influences the other variables. Now, experimental studies allow for more control over the variables, and this will reduce the confounding of two variables. But we still have to watch out for it. So the way this works is, again, the researcher now, they don't just observe and watch how the sample naturally divides. The researcher actively divides the sample into two or more groups. The first group we'll call a treatment group. This is the group of the sample participants who will receive the treatment. This is the manipulation that the researcher is introducing into the study. And then there's the other group, which is the control group, and this is the group of the participants, the group of the sample participants who do not receive the treatment being tested. Okay, so we have treatment groups and control groups. Then the researcher will make the comparison between the treatment and the control group, and again, we're trying to make, the researcher is trying to draw some conclusions. But if we want accurate conclusions to be drawn, the treatment and control groups must, again, we have this theme here, they must be randomly selected, but alike in all aspects except for what we're doing in the treatment. So you don't want to have, because if they're alike in every other way but the treatment, this will reduce the lurking or confounding variable problem. Okay. So let's just go into, in example 7, under what conditions would the following scenario be observational studies or experimental studies? Okay, so let's just take one for simplicity. A researcher wishes to determine if listening to jazz while studying can improve. Now here's a key word here. We want to know if it's going to improve a student's grade. So in the observational, the researcher is not going to do anything. The sample is going to naturally subdivide. So let's say, now we want to also, we have to have the natural subdivision, and we also have to work with this improvement. Okay, so step 1 might be, we have to have some kind of baseline. So let's give a pretest. This will give us some baseline observation. Then, once we have this baseline observation, then what could happen then is the researcher would give out, say, study materials to the the sample, and leave them alone for a while and let them work with the learning materials. Now, while you're leaving them alone, what's going to happen? Let's see. So we give out the learning materials. What's going to happen? You leave them alone, and then you start observing. Some of the students are going to listen to jazz. They will break into two groups. There will be those that listen to jazz and those that do not listen to jazz. And the researcher has no effect on this. The sample is going to naturally subdivide itself. Okay. After the specified period of time, then we can give the retest so we can look and see at the scores. Did the scores improve? And finally, then 5, you could record the results and try and make the determination. Did the retest scores for the students who listened to jazz, were those higher than their baseline observation? If it was experimental, one thing that we could do, many of it would stay the same. Again, we could give the pretest so we can get the baseline observation. And again, we'll hand out the learning materials, whatever we are asking the participants to learn. But now, instead of just watching what happens, the researcher is going to split the group. In this case, into 2. And then for the first group, so we split the group. So the first group, the research would then play jazz, perhaps pipe it over the intercom or give them through the speaker system, or they might give them something to listen on their iPad. I'm not sure. But anyway, the researcher will in some way give a certain portion of that group or half of the group jazz to listen to, and they would give no jazz to the other. All right, then give them some time, give the students some time to do the learning. Then you would do the retest. And then 5, you could record those results.